Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Can You Give Me 5? Today we are discussing natural selection and adaptations. Let's get you ready for that AP Environmental Science exam.
We've got a quick roadmap today. First, we'll hit fitness and adaptations. Second, we'll break down natural selection. And third, we're heading out to the islands to talk about the famous Galapagos finches.
All right, let's jump right into Segment 1, Fitness and Adaptations. Before we talk about evolution, we gotta understand where biological differences even come from. It really boils down to two main sources of genetic variability. On one hand, you have random mutations, which are literally just copy errors that happen when DNA replicates. On the other hand, you have crossing over, and that's when chromosomes swap genetic info during meiosis. The key takeaway here, every single population naturally has some underlying genetic diversity built right in.
So, what does all that diversity actually do? Well, that brings us to fitness. And no, in biology, fitness isn't about how much you can bench press. It's strictly about an organism's ability to survive long enough to reproduce in its specific environment. Bottom line, if you survive and pass on your genes, you've got high fitness.
And that leads perfectly into adaptations. An adaptation is a new trait, born from all that genetic variability we just talked about, that gives an organism a leg up. It's actively advantageous. It boosts their fitness, helps them survive, and gets those genes passed to the next generation.
Moving on to Segment 2, Understanding Natural Selection.
So what actually is natural selection? Simply put, it's the process where organisms that are better adapted to their environment end up surviving and producing more offspring. Now, listen closely to this part because it's a huge trap on exams. Individuals do not evolve during their lifetimes. You can't just decide you need wings and grow them, right? Instead, populations evolve over time as those advantageous traits spread generation after generation.
But what's actually driving that whole process? It's something called selective pressure. Think of this as the environmental force. Maybe it's a new predator, a brutal disease, or maybe food suddenly gets super scarce. This pressure is what actively weeds out the less fit individuals. It essentially selects who makes it and who doesn't.
Let's visualize this with a classic example. Imagine a hawk hunting a group of mice. Thanks to genetic variability, some of these mice have tan fur and some have gray fur. Here, the hawk is our selective pressure. If the ground is dark, that hawk is going to easily spot and eat the tan mice. That immediately makes the gray fur a highly beneficial adaptation. The gray mice blend in, they survive, and they reproduce.
To make this super easy to remember for your test, let's break the mechanics of natural selection down into 4 chronological steps. Step 1. Genetic variability already exists in the population. Step 2. The environment applies a selective pressure. Step 3. The organisms with the advantageous traits survive that pressure. And Step 4. Those lucky survivors pass their winning traits down to their offspring.
And here's a crucial thing to remember. Context is everything. Think about a 7-foot-tall basketball player. On the court, that height is a massive advantage. It's basically an adaptation for that specific game. But put that exact same person in a 26-mile marathon, suddenly it's a huge disadvantage because it takes way too much energy to move that much mass. The rule here is simple. A trait is only an adaptation if the current specific environment actually favors it.
All right, let's bring it all together with Segment 3, the Galapagos finches.
We're going to look at a famous real-world case study from the island of Daphne Major. Back in 1977, the island was hit by a brutal drought. This acted as a massive, sudden selective pressure. It completely wiped out the normal food supply, meaning the seeds that the local finches relied on became much larger, way drier, and incredibly hard to crack open.
The numbers from the study tell an incredible story. In 1976, the average finch beak size was 9.5 millimeters. But by 1978, just 2 years later, it had jumped up to 10.2 millimeters. Why the sudden change? Because the birds with smaller beaks simply couldn't crack those tough new seeds and they starved. Only the finches with large, strong beaks survived to pass on their genes. It's a perfect real-world proof of a rapid evolutionary shift.
So what actually dictates how fast a species can adapt like that? It usually comes down to 3 main factors. First, the rate of environmental change. Second, the level of genetic diversity already in the population. And third, their generation time and lifespan. For example, bacteria have insanely short lifespans, so they can evolve in a matter of days. Humans, we take thousands of years.
But here's the really scary part, especially today. When environmental change happens too rapidly,
Like what we're seeing right now with ocean temperatures spiking and losing oxygen, species just don't have the time they need to genetically adapt. If the environment changes faster than their generation time, they're left with only two brutal choices: migrate somewhere else immediately or face total extinction.
Which leaves us with a pretty thought-provoking question for you to chew on. How might rapid, modern climate change act as a selective pressure on a species right in your own local ecosystem? Look out your window at the plants and animals in your own backyard and think about how they might be forced to adapt. Thanks for giving me 5. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment.